Welcome to The Debate. Today we're unpacking a really phenomenal document in the conversation around criminal justice reform. It's Julia Paul's Blueprint for Change, the End Recidivism Master Script. And before we really get into the weeds, we have to start by just acknowledging the sheer scale of the crisis Paul's is tackling here.
Yeah, the numbers they're staggering.
Exactly. We are looking at a national rearrest rate that currently exceeds 68%. More than half of all returning citizens are re-entering custody within just 3 years of their release. And the financial toll it's immense. Counties are spending anywhere from $40,000 to $115,000 per person per year just to incarcerate them. It is a catastrophic failure of design.
It is. And Paul's blueprint explicitly identifies the leaks in this system upon release, specifically pointing to a combination of missing factors. She notes that returning citizens have no ID, no housing, no grounding, and no emotional support. It's a massive, multi-tiered failure.
Right, and the debate we're diving into today really centers on her proposed solution. Does focusing primarily on trauma-informed emotional repair and, non-clinical community support, does that adequately rebuild the architecture of reentry, or does it prioritize emotional scaffolding at the expense of addressing the hard logistical leaks of the system? I'll be arguing that the blueprint's trauma-informed focus on identity, emotion, and community is the essential foundational scaffolding needed to stabilize returning citizens and finally end the cycle of recidivism.
And I'll be arguing that while emotional regulation is undeniably valuable, positioning non-clinical tools and community emotional support as the primary solution to a system lacking physical infrastructure, like housing and state IDs, it really conflates psychological healing with systemic architecture.
To really get into this, we have to look closely at why the traditional system fails so predictably. The current framework relies almost entirely on supervision, and mathematically speaking, supervision alone fails us. You don't get a 68% rearrest rate if your system works. Supervision watches people. It doesn't heal them. Paul's model is, well, it's revolutionary because it correctly identifies where the wound actually is. The blueprint specifies that the wound isn't just logistical, it's in emotion, identity, and community.
But is it just there?
Not just there, no, but it's the root. The evidence Paul's presents is really clear on this. Trauma-informed programming directly targets fear responses, memory triggers, and identity repair. This emotional stabilization isn't some secondary nice-to-have feature. It's the absolute prerequisite for any other success. And she backs this up with a very compelling economic validation, estimating a $3.30 return on every single dollar invested in this kind of care.
Right, the ROI.
Yeah, that return is generated because emotional grounding helps individuals avoid future costs, crisis situations, and emergency interventions. Without that internal stability, any external resources you provide are completely ineffective.
I want to be clear right out of the gate here. The financial ROI makes total sense, and treating trauma is essential. Untreated fear responses absolutely drive crisis. But my core issue here is the alignment between the problem as Paul's herself defines it and the solutions the blueprint ultimately prioritizes. If we look at the opening of the text, she defines the system leaks perfectly. She says no ID, no housing, no grounding, and no emotional support. That is a dual failure. It's structural and it's psychological.
Agreed.
But the solutions provided in the text, specifically the Storm Squad and the 84-page affirmation coloring book, they aggressively target only the latter half of the problem. They address grounding and emotion. They do not inherently rebuild the structural architecture necessary to solve the lack of IDs and housing. You simply cannot regulate your mood out of lacking basic identification.
Well,
You can't deep breathe your way into an apartment lease. Offering emotional tools to solve structural voids is a profound mismatch in the blueprint.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on what actually constitutes systemic architecture. I think you're defining architecture purely in terms of bureaucracy and concrete, but Paul's argues that the human element is the missing infrastructure. Structural resources mean absolutely nothing if the individual is in an active state of crisis when they receive them.
Okay, but
Let me just paint a picture of what she means when she talks about the Storm Squad being the first safe voice someone hears after release. Imagine walking out of a facility after 5 or 10 years. The sensory overload alone is paralyzing. The noise of traffic, the sheer volume of choices you suddenly have to make, the immediate panic of survival. When a returning citizen steps out, their trauma responses, memory triggers, and hypervigilance are at their absolute peak.
I acknowledge the shock of release is real, sure.
Right. So if you hand that person an ID and a housing voucher, but they have no grounding and no sense of belonging, they will still fall through the cracks. The physiological reality of release is what Pauls is addressing. That human connection provided by the Storm Squad is the vital architecture that keeps the individual stabilized long enough to actually walk into a leasing office or secure employment.
I come at it from a different way when we talk about rebuilding architecture. The blueprint explicitly states ending the cycle requires rebuilding the architecture, not harsher sentences, but stronger scaffolding. When I hear the word architecture in the context of state infrastructure, an infrastructure that currently costs taxpayers up to $115,000 per person annually, I expect institutional change.
But institutional change clearly hasn't worked.
Because the institutions aren't providing what people need. But Paul's primary proof point for new architecture is the Storm Squad, which she describes as a diverse, community-driven support team providing non-clinical emotional stabilization. Placing the burden of an incredibly well-funded carceral failure onto community volunteers feels deeply disproportionate. Rebuilding architecture should mean passing policies that automatically issue state IDs upon release. It should mean guaranteed transitional housing.
I hear you.
A community volunteer team is a wonderful safety net, but it's not institutional architecture. If the state is spending $115,000 to lock someone up, scaling a solution that relies on non-clinical volunteers feels like this state is just abdicating its structural responsibilities entirely.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it creates a false dichotomy between emotional support and logistical success. The blueprint replaces a punitive logistical toolbar, parole supervision, with a restorative emotional one. By resolving the fear responses, the blueprint empowers the returning citizen to navigate those logistical walls you mentioned. Paul says the Storm Squad provides guidance. Guidance means helping individuals navigate the absolute labyrinth of securing that ID. You know how hard it is to get an ID without a fixed address, right?
oh, it's a bureaucratic nightmare. You need a birth certificate to get an ID, but you often need an ID to request a birth certificate.
Exactly. It's a catch-22. And a traditional parole officer doesn't have the time or the mandate to sit with someone for 4 hours at the DMV and talk them down when they start getting dysregulated by the frustration of that process. The emotional scaffolding provided by the Storm Squad is exactly what makes securing the logistical scaffolding possible.
I don't disagree that having a guide at the DMV is helpful. But is it intellectually rigorous to redefine architecture as psychological safety when the material explicitly lists no ID, no housing as the primary systemic leaks? Handing an ID to someone in an active trauma response doesn't guarantee success, sure. But handing psychological safety to someone who legally does not exist in the eyes of the state guarantees failure.
I don't think it guarantees failure at all.
Handing someone a beautifully designed emotional support system when they don't have a state ID is like giving someone an incredibly detailed recipe when they don't have a kitchen. You're grounded, you're focused, but you still can't legally rent an apartment or get a W-2 job.
I think you're underestimating how much of the logistical failure is driven by the emotional dysregulation.
Let's look closer at the specific tools making up this emotional scaffolding then. The blueprint introduces a trauma-sensitive affirmation coloring book as a primary initiative. Pauls describes it as an SEL-based 84-page tool that aids emotional grounding, mood regulation, and self-expression. Now, I value social-emotional learning, and I acknowledge her point that this creative method reduces anxiety. But I'm sorry, I just don't buy that as a systemic solution. Let me tell you why.
Go ahead.
The text concludes with a direct call to action to judges, lawmakers, commissioners. We are talking about replacing a carceral apparatus that consumes over $100,000 per person per year. Are we seriously presenting an 84-page affirmation coloring book to state commissioners as a primary structural pillar of systemic reform? There is a vast difference between a helpful therapeutic exercise and a systemic master script for ending recidivism.
It's incredibly easy to dismiss a coloring book if you evaluate it through the lens of traditional punitive bureaucracy. But you have to look at it through the physiological framework Pauls provides. Let's talk about that term she uses, SEL, or social-emotional learning. We usually hear that term applied to elementary school education, right? Teaching kids how to name their feelings. But here, Pauls is adapting it for adults whose nervous systems have been locked in a state of hyper-threat for years.
And I respect the adaptation.
But think about how it plays out in reality. When someone is in that hyper-threat state, a complex bureaucratic form isn't just annoying. It triggers a full-blown threat response. A frustrated clerk at the housing office is suddenly perceived as a physical danger. That leads to an altercation, which leads to a parole violation, which leads right back to a $115,000 jail cell. You don't regulate that kind of nervous system dysregulation with a bloated state program. You regulate it with accessible, non-clinical tools that meet the individual exactly where they are.
A coloring book regulates the threat response.
Yes, the repetitive, focused nature of it brings the prefrontal cortex back online. Paul specifically notes this tool reduces anxiety and increases engagement. That engagement keeps a returning citizen communicating with their storm squad, attending their meetings, and staying out of the emergency room. Presenting this to lawmakers isn't naive. It's a profound paradigm shift. It forces a judge to recognize that an 84-page SEL tool might do significantly more to prevent a rearrest than a probation officer ever could.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the risk of presenting this specific paradigm shift to lawmakers? Lawmakers are highly motivated by cost-saving measures. When you tell a state commissioner that the solution to a deeply complex, expensive structural failure is a community volunteer squad and a creative SEL tool, you are inadvertently giving the state permission to ignore the structural leaks.
I don't think it gives them permission to ignore anything. It gives them a working model.
But look at human nature and politics. If lawmakers believe they can solve the recidivism crisis by just funding non-clinical community groups and printing affirmation books, they will never, ever allocate the massive capital required to build transitional housing or overhaul the DMV's ID processing system. The blueprint asks the community to scale a system that finally works. My deep concern is that scaling this specific blueprint scales the emotional support while leaving the structural void completely intact.
Let's bring it back to the statistical context Pauls provides to see why scaling this is absolutely the necessary next step. We have a baseline failure rate of 68%. That is the reality of the current structural, concrete, and bureaucracy approach. The trauma-informed model, according to the blueprint, saves millions by reducing crisis and yields a $3.30 return on every dollar invested.
Right. The ROI.
Yes, and let's break down what that $3.30 actually means. It's not just an abstract number. It comes from avoided future costs. What is an avoided cost in this context? It's an avoided police dispatch, which costs hundreds of dollars. It's an avoided psychiatric hold in an ER, which costs thousands. It's avoided public defender hours and court fees. Pauls boldly declares, the math proves the mission. If the data shows that focusing on emotional regulation fundamentally changes the trajectory of returning citizens to the point of generating a 330% return, then the model works. Scaling this isn't an excuse for the state to do less. It's a mandate for the state to invest its resources where they actually generate human and financial returns.
I completely agree with the breakdown of those hidden costs. A psychiatric hold is wildly expensive and deeply traumatizing. And yes, avoiding it is a huge win. But you just highlighted my exact concern. The math proves the mission of harm reduction. We are saving money because people are not having psychiatric emergencies and they aren't being rearrested for minor infractions triggered by dysregulation. That is incredibly important. But avoided future costs do not automatically translate into proactive structural investment.
They free up the capital to make those investments.
Do they?
A $330 return in avoided emergency room visits doesn't put a roof over someone's head unless the state purposefully takes those exact savings and redirects them into a housing trust fund. And Paul's blueprint doesn't mandate that redirection. It calls for lawmakers to say yes to this working emotional model. But if the model only explicitly details emotional and community scaffolding, A lawmaker's yes is incomplete. They are saying yes to stopping the bleeding, but they aren't saying yes to rebuilding the house. That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. You're treating the emotional repair as merely stopping the bleeding, but Pauls frames it as pouring the foundation of the house itself. She writes, ending the cycle requires rebuilding the architecture. This is how we stop people from falling through the cracks. The blueprint makes the case that the cracks aren't just administrative gaps, they're the moments of profound isolation, fear, and lost identity that cause a person to lose hope and reoffend.
I hear that. The psychological shock is real.
It's everything. When Pauls points out that we lose people the moment they step out of the facility, she is demanding we look at the immediate timeline of reentry. A housing voucher that gets processed 3 weeks later does absolutely nothing for the guy having a panic attack on the sidewalk on day 1. The Storm Squad does. The affirmation and mood regulation tools do. By addressing the immediate visceral reality of the individual's trauma, you secure the foundation. You simply cannot build the logistical walls of housing and employment until the foundation of identity and emotional regulation is poured.
I concede that the psychological shock of release has been historically, almost criminally ignored by the traditional system. But my pushback remains firmly anchored in Palsey's own definition of the leaks. She lists no ID, no housing, right alongside no grounding and no emotional support. If this blueprint is truly the master script for ending recidivism, as the title claims, it has to be interrogated for its balance.
And you feel it's unbalanced.
Wildly unbalanced. It offers incredibly detailed, actionable solutions for grounding and emotional support. We get the Storm Squad, we get the SEL methodology, we get the 84-page tool, we get the exact mechanics of how to regulate the nervous system, but it offers zero actionable solutions for the ID and housing leaks. It relies entirely on the premise that a stabilized individual will somehow magically overcome systemic barriers that currently cost the state $115,000 a year to manage. I think it is dangerous to assume that emotional regulation can outmaneuver systemic disenfranchisement. A highly regulated, deeply grounded, trauma-informed individual without an ID is still legally paralyzed in our society.
I don't think Pauls assumes magic. I'd argue the blueprint clearly implies that the community-driven support team operates as the active bridge over that systemic disenfranchisement. When she writes that the system lacks support, she's addressing the isolation of the returning citizen. By injecting an active, diverse community team into the equation, the blueprint creates a localized, adaptable network. The Storm Squad can navigate those logistical barriers faster and more efficiently than a rigid state bureaucracy ever could, precisely because they aren't bound by the red tape.
But they shouldn't have to.
Maybe they shouldn't have to in a utopian society, but we are dealing with the reality on the ground. The blueprint doesn't ignore the lack of IDs and housing. It changes the agent responsible for helping the individual secure them. Instead of relying on a probation officer whose primary function is to monitor for failure, looking for a reason to violate someone, you now have a support team whose primary function is to guide towards success.
But that brings us right back to my core concern about the state's responsibility versus community burden. If the state creates the conditions of disenfranchisement by releasing people without basic identification and legally barring them from certain public housing, relying on community volunteers to navigate that state-sanctioned disenfranchisement is a policy failure. Even if it results in a psychological success for the individual, it lets the system off the hook. We are asking everyday community members and SEL tools to carry the entire weight of a systematic architecture that refuses to reform its own logistical barriers.
I think we've really drilled down to the fundamental tension here. As we draw this discussion to a close, I want to synthesize where I stand on Paul's work. The source material makes an incredibly compelling data-backed case that the cycle of recidivism is fundamentally driven by untreated trauma and a severe lack of psychological safety. The traditional system fails at a rate of 68% because it completely ignores the physiological and human reality of reentry. By utilizing tools like the Storm Squad and SEL-based engagement, Julia Paul's blueprint provides the exact emotional and community scaffolding required to stabilize individuals in those crucial first days and months. The text demonstrates that treating the wound of identity and emotion isn't just some secondary therapeutic add-on to structural reform, it is the very architecture that prevents individuals from falling through the cracks. and the $3.3 ROI proves it generates immense social and financial returns.
And to synthesize my perspective, I completely validate the absolute necessity of emotional healing. The $3.30 ROI achieved through trauma-informed care is brilliant, and breaking down the hidden costs of crisis response shows exactly why this care is needed. But true systemic change cannot be solely psychological. Pauls correctly identifies the systemic leaks as a combination of structural deficits like ID and housing and emotional ones. If we are going to present a master script to lawmakers and judges, we have to ensure that non-clinical trauma-informed initiatives are paired with hard, concrete solutions for those logistical leaks. Expecting emotional regulation and community volunteers to act as the sole architecture against state disenfranchisement asks far too much of psychological tools and demands far too little of our state infrastructure.
Despite coming at this from different angles, it is very clear we both find absolute agreement on the premise established early in the blueprint. The current system's architecture is a catastrophic failure. A model where more than half of returning citizens re-enter custody within 3 years, bleeding taxpayers for over $100,000 per person annually, is totally unsustainable. We are entirely aligned that the traditional method of punitive supervision, devoid of any trauma-informed support, is a massive human and financial waste.
Absolutely. The status quo is entirely indefensible, and Paul's insistence that we must shift toward trauma-informed care is a vital, necessary evolution in how we even begin to approach reentry.
Analyzing this blueprint truly reveals the complex tension at the heart of criminal justice reform. It is this delicate, often frustrating balance between deeply personal psychological needs and unyielding logistical realities. For anyone engaging with this text, it invites a much deeper exploration into how we as a society choose to define and build systemic support. There is so much more to unpack within these concepts of architecture, healing, and state responsibility. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.